I just saw the 3rd season of Love, Death and Robots, and we should talk about it. You should play the Love, Death and Robots intro. And then I just cut that off and be like, but first, a word from our sponsor. Arora, Age of Desolation is a 5th edition campaign setting which is packed, filled to the gills with a horde of new dragons. And we actually have a huge, I think it's like a foot tall dragon. It's massive. Oh yeah.
Hello, I am Torishova, the Crimson Doom. I'm here to tell you about Arora, Age of Desolation.
This thing is huge. Has a wingspan that is bigger than my head. I don't think it quite qualifies as a miniature. This is the crown jewel. This is Torishova, the Crimson Doom, the head of the Morgenstrom realm. Wait, what's the realm called? Is it Morgstürmer?
Morgstürmer! And I am suffering from a bad case of shard scale, which is making me act crazy.
You're not you when you're hangry. This thing is a monster, both literally and figuratively, and you should back if you want to get your hands on Torishova. Torishova demands space. Hello, my name is Byrne, and in this video, I'm going to talk about my 5 favorite episodes from Love, Death, and Robots from Season 3 that you should definitely watch to inspire your D&D campaign. If you haven't seen Season 3 yet, or Love, Death, and Robots at all, consider this your spoiler warning for 5 of the episodes in Season 3. You can see them in the timestamps below. If you've watched some and not the others, you can come back and watch it. Just go watch it. It's amazing. Fair warning, a content warning, if you will. Extreme violence and gore, because Love, Death, and Robots is a series that is not shy about showing you the internal workings of the human body. Let's just put it that way. Did that sound too medical? That sounded weird. It's very violent. In Vaulted Halls, Entombed. In this episode, a squadron of Marines are moving through the desert. They're on a mission to rescue some hostages, and they discover a cave. And when they begin exploring the cave, things pretty quickly start to get out of hand. This episode is rife with inspiration for describing how swarms of rats or bats or insects attack the player characters and can give you ideas about how to describe biting apart little bits of the character in really visceral detail. The main strength of this episode is teaching you how to build tension in a dungeon, work towards some sort of horrifying climax, rather than just attacking the players with the biggest monster you have the moment they walk in. When the Marines enter the cave, they enter the dungeon, they don't find anything initially except for this weird glowing slime, which might evoke some arcana checks or investigation checks. They find the bones of folks that have come in here before them, only died relatively recently, and so it seems impossible that they would be this decayed this quickly. Then they get attacked by the small spider creatures. Then they witness the horror of what it's like to have these creatures tear a person apart tiny piece by piece. And then after all of that, after those encounters, they discover the truth of this place as a terrible prison for a dark deity. You don't need to attack your player characters the second they walk into a dungeon. Let them explore in relative calm and build the tension and escalate the level of encounters. They only discover that the dragon is sleeping at the bottom of the lair once they get down there. It's also a cool episode for catching your players off guard, I think, because you can take relatively low-level characters into a cave that they think is just filled with goblins or bandits or something like that, but as they get deeper and deeper into the cave, they realize that, oh no, this adventure is much more than it initially seemed. They might not have any way of combating the Cthulhian creature at the bottom of the dungeon themselves, much as the Marines' weapons would have been useless against it, but they can figure out other ways of accomplishing the goals of this adventure by keeping the creature locked away. Bad traveling. This was probably my favorite episode of the season, and just so happens to probably be the most violent episode of the season. But that's a coincidence. The crew aboard a ship that hunts for shark meat in the deep waters of the ocean find themselves victims to a giant crustacean which leaps aboard and begins slaughtering the crew. Crustacean, like a crab that crits, like a... There's very little that the crew can do to stop this monster, and those that it slays, it begins to horrifically feast upon. The monster turns out to be intelligent and telepathic, able to speak to one of the crew members through the corpses of one of his mates, and demands to be taken to an island where there is civilization so that the monster can continue to feed and have food to provide for his...
How many mouths to feed?
The remainder of the crew then have to battle among themselves as to whether they fulfill the monster's wishes and spell doom for others, or whether they risk the monster's ire by taking it to a deserted island and trying to leave it there. The episode is intense and it is gory, but even seeing the monster when there's relatively little gore on screen is probably the most disconcerting thing about the episode. When one of the crew members is almost eaten by the monster and manages to ferret their way into a stairwell that the monster can't get to them, you see all the little tentacles around the monster's mouth. You see its beady eyes look hungrily at the crew member, and this is just textbook how to describe a monster to your players in a way that makes them feel revulsed and fearful of what their fate would be if they fell victim to this horrific thing. What this episode shows best is how to put player characters in a challenging situation that they can't simply fight their way out of. Confront a low-level party with a high-level threat, something that they couldn't possibly beat if they tried to attack it outright. But also give the monster a reason not to simply quash the party. Maybe it needs their help for some reason. And this creates a situation where the party have to think more cleverly than just using their combat abilities on the character sheet. Can they trick the monster? Can they give the monster something else it wants? Or can they come to some sort of compromise? That is up for your characters to decide. Swarm. Two scientists begin studying an alien insect hive which appears to function flawlessly, if not in a bit of a creepy, crawly, gross Cthulhian mythos kind of way. It does, like the alien dude at the start says, "We will pick you up in 632 days. But it turns out that this hive is more intelligent than it first appears, and the final scene of the episode is the two scientists having a conversation, with one of them having tentacles drilled into its brain and their body, and the giant brain of the hive talking through them to the other scientist. So, you know, like normal. This episode could be fantastic inspiration for how to run a mind flayer colony, because basically that big brain at the end is functionally just an elder brain. The way that I like to run mind flayers is to sort of not run mind flayers. And what I mean by that is that mind flayers are creatures that are so intelligent, they plan so far into the future that there probably isn't need for them to involve themselves in situations that much themselves. Maybe the player characters hear about a hive of insects, of giant mutated insects, which are expanding a hive in a desolate part of the forest, but they're starting to come into conflict with the locals. And as the players begin to investigate and explore this hive, they find that it is an inner working of all these different types of creatures working together, creating this society among themselves. They're not even all particularly violent, only attacking if the player characters attack them first. As you further explore deeper and deeper into this hive, you discover what you're actually seeing is a coalition of mind flayer thralls that are working to create a gateway down into the Underdark. The encounter with the mind flayers only happens at the end, and much like in this episode and also in Vaulted Halls Entombed, the ultimate horror of what's happening is only revealed in the very last room of the dungeon. It's only something the players realize when it's perhaps too late to do anything about it. Night of the Mini Dead. This episode is both adorable and hilarious in how horrifying it is because it's an entire zombie apocalypse playing out in the space of 7 minutes. It's the shortest episode. Honestly, the only thing that really inspired me about this episode for D&D is that the giant zombies vomit radiation. And I just thought that was funny, but I also thought that was a really cool idea because giants in 5th edition D&D don't tend to have many extra rules beyond squash, kick, and throw a rock. And if they're a cloud giant or they're a, special giant from previously Volo's guide, now Mordenkainen presents Monsters of the Anyway, that maybe they get a spell or two or some extra rule. Most giants, especially the stone giant, the hill giant, the fire giant doesn't have any cool fire abilities. He's just a dude that likes fire. Give your giants the ability to vomit up radiation or fire or something else like that. Just make it almost like a fireball type attack. Maybe a 10-foot radius circle and anybody next to it has to take a con save and take necrotic damage or a dex save to avoid taking fire damage. And actually, the one thing it reminded me of was in Attack on Titan, how the Titans vomit up their victims. They don't eat for sustenance, and they have these almost like fur balls of munched up people that stick to the corners of wherever they happen to land. And I think you could create quite an effective horror giant monster if one of its attacks was literally to throw up the victims that it had just eaten, and it does necrotic and or bludgeoning damage. And ewy.
Jibaro.
This episode is called
Jibaro.
Everybody is talking about this episode, not just because it has some of the most stunning visuals, I think, in any Love, Death and Robots episode, depending on your preference for art style. This story of a siren who becomes enamored with a conquistador knight, who in turn becomes enamored with her, but perhaps not for very altruistic reasons, is steeped in deeper meaning. And I could probably do an entire video on how to create deeper themes and deeper meanings for your D&D campaigns. Let me know if you want me to do that. But for now, this episode inspires for me how to make sirens and similar fae-like creatures formidable. The siren's call is not one of seduction, it is one of compulsion. The conquistador knights forced out onto the water rather than being lured out to their doom. The siren's dance is powerful and emotive, and it causes absolute chaos and anarchy, and the knights begin slashing at each other and are dragged under the water in their heavy armor. I contend any creature that doesn't have a swim speed should not be able to swim in heavy armor. This episode presents an alien, frightening-like creature that isn't the seductive woman who is barely clothed in her lily pads or seaweeds or whatever it happens to be covering the typical siren or Rizulka. The idea that she's covered in coins and beads as well is really otherworldly. She doesn't look like she grew up out of the pond like a lot of fae creatures are presented. She looks truly supernatural and ethereal, and I really like this idea. The fact that the knight, who cannot hear and does not initially fall victim to the siren's call, still falls victim in a way to the lure of the gold that she wears. She still represents desire, but not in any sort of emotional way, more of a materialistic sense. Oh yeah, we got to do an outro. Outro time. Keeping you on your toes there. And those were my 5 favorite episodes from season 3 of Love, Death and Robots. If you haven't seen it before, definitely check it out. The other 3 episodes of that season are particularly good as well. And I loved season 1. Season 1, I could do a whole video on that too. If you want me to, let me know in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe to the channel, give it a like, because we will be back next week, as every week, talking all about D&D, dark fantasy, and maybe some love, death, and some robots.